Well, not many showbiz relationships survive, but one of the most endearing and enduring Hollywood love stories was between Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward.
He promised his daughters $50 million each. Then he died, and they got nothing close to it.
He's very good looking and very sexy and all of those things, but all that goes out the window finally, and what finally is left is if you can make somebody laugh, then that's very important.
Keep her laughing.
And he sure does keep me laughing.
For over a decade, Paul Newman's family said almost nothing about what really happened to his fortune after his death in 2008. Then his daughters started talking, first in a memoir built from tapes he burned with his own hands, but that somehow survived anyway, then in a courtroom that aired the family's private grief in public for the first time. What they revealed wasn't just about money. It was about a man the world thought it knew completely. A man who turned out to be hiding more doubt, more guilt, and more last-minute decisions than anyone realized, right up until his very final signature. A promise made at a family meeting. Start here because this is the part almost nobody knows. Years before Paul Newman died, he sat his daughters down and told them something most parents with that kind of money never have to say out loud. There would be no traditional inheritance. He believed handing his kids a fortune would ruin their ambition and their lives. So instead, he set up a different plan. Each daughter would run her own charitable foundation, seeded with around $500,000, and they'd take turns sitting on the board of his company, Newman's own, deciding where the real money went every single year. His daughter Susan has said her father was clear about this for years, that the family accepted it without resentment, because that was simply who he was. Around 2007, the plan even seemed to grow more generous. Newman told his advisor he wanted to leave each daughter $1 million on top of the existing setup, a noticeable increase from what they'd been told before, and in a video interview not long before his death, he said plainly that all of his children would get a set amount to give away every year, and that they'd be giving away his estate right alongside him while he was still around to see it happen. This wasn't an abstract promise floating around in family conversation either. His daughters were already living it. They sat on the boards of his companies and his foundation. They'd grown up watching him build something genuinely unusual in Hollywood, a fortune designed from the start to be handed off and given away rather than hoarded, and they had every reason to believe their role in that process was permanent. Then, 6 months before he died, something changed. Quietly, without a family meeting, without warning, Paul Newman rewrote the plan one final time. And when his daughters found out what the new version actually said, none of the promises they'd grown up hearing were still in it. The man behind the eyes. Everyone thought they knew. Before getting into what happened with the will, you need to understand something that the public never really saw, because Paul Newman spent decades curating exactly what people were allowed to know about him. In 1986, he sat down with his friend, screenwriter Stuart Stern, and started recording a series of deeply personal interviews, not just with himself, but with his first wife, his children, his closest collaborators, and Joanne Woodward, his wife of 50 years. The plan was to turn it all into a memoir. 5 years into the project, he abandoned it completely, and at some point afterward, he actually burned the original audio tapes himself, by his own hand, with no public explanation for why. By pure luck, full transcripts of every interview had already been typed up, and those pages survived in storage for decades, essentially forgotten until after his death, when his family went looking through his Connecticut home and found them. What was on those pages surprised even the people who thought they knew him best. Newman described himself as a deeply self-doubting man who genuinely struggled with whether he deserved any of the success he'd gotten, someone who privately compared himself unfavorably to actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean his entire career, despite winning an Academy Award himself. In his own words, he admitted flatly that he simply didn't have a gift for fathering, and that being a celebrity threw everything out of balance for the children who had to grow up next to that fame. He talked candidly about heavy drinking in the early 70s that he admitted got dangerously out of control. He also admitted to something the public rarely heard about directly. While still married to his first wife, Jackie Whitty, he fell into a years-long affair with Joanne Woodward, an affair he later described in his own words as something close to brutal in how detached it made him from the family he already had. He wrote that the guilt from how he'd handled that divorce and how poorly he'd explained it to his own children at the time was something he carried for the rest of his life. His daughters Melissa and Clea eventually helped turn those transcripts into a published memoir, working through years of recordings that revealed a far more anxious, self-critical man than the confident screen icon audiences had spent half a century watching. One of the family's collaborators on the project later said the daughters faced a real tension while putting the book together, caught between wanting to honor their father's legacy and the simple fact that the tapes revealed a man who was, in their own words, often distant and difficult, even while being loving toward them. Clea has since said openly that there was a real gap between how the public viewed her father and how he privately understood himself, and that by the time he was raising her and her sisters, he'd genuinely become a more dedicated, more present parent than he'd ever managed to be during his first marriage. That tension between image and reality runs through almost everything that happened next. The son the world barely remembers. Here's a part of the story that gets mentioned constantly but rarely explained honestly, and it matters more than people realize once you understand what came later. Paul Newman's first marriage, to a woman named Jackie Whitty, produced 3 children: a son, Scott, born in 1950, and 2 daughters, Susan and Stephanie, born shortly after. The marriage ended in 1958. The same year, Newman married Joanne Woodward, and Scott grew up carrying a weight that's almost impossible to imagine, being the only son of one of the most famous men in the world, while his parents' marriage quietly fell apart behind him. Scott tried building his own identity. He worked as a stuntman on his father's films, completed hundreds of parachute jumps to get certified as an instructor, and refused financial help whenever he could manage it, telling a reporter in the early 70s that you couldn't stand on your father's feet forever, that eventually you needed your own. He landed roles in films like The Towering Inferno and Breakheart Pass, sometimes acting alongside his father, always under the shadow of being compared to him. But the drinking started young, and it got worse. He was arrested more than once for alcohol-related incidents, and at one especially low point, assaulted a police officer while drunk, an episode his father quietly paid to settle. He told a family friend privately that it was difficult being his father's son, that Hollywood kept trying to use him as a way to reach Paul, that he sometimes felt like nothing more than an extension of someone else's name, joking bitterly that he might as well have been called Paul Newman Jr. In November of 1978, after a motorcycle accident left him relying on pain medication, Scott Newman died from a combination of those pills, alcohol, and other substances. He was 28 years old. Police ruled it accidental. He had accepted psychiatric help in his final months, paid for by his father, but it came too late to change what happened. Paul Newman never fully recovered from it. In his memoir, decades later, he wrote about getting down on his knees asking for Scott's forgiveness, wondering aloud what he could have done differently, admitting that he'd once made choices he later deeply regretted with his son, and later wondered if that had somehow fed into what killed him. He wrote that he'd assumed Scott was going through a phase, that he never thought it would actually be fatal, and that he wished he'd told his son directly that it was fine not to want the same life Paul had built for himself. He started the Scott Newman Center afterward, an organization dedicated to substance abuse prevention, the most direct and lasting response he ever gave the public to his son's death. It's worth sitting with that grief for a moment, because the man who later restructured his entire estate without telling his surviving children was the same man who spent the rest of his life quietly devastated by how he'd failed to protect the one child he'd already lost. A fortune, a foundation, and a name nobody expected. By 2005, Paul Newman had built something remarkable out of a joke. Newman's Own, the food brand that started as homemade salad dressing he gave away to friends and neighbors at Christmas, had become a company that donated 100% of its after-tax profits to charity, eventually generating hundreds of millions of dollars for causes he cared about, from children's hospitals to environmental projects to addiction prevention programs carrying his late son's name. He folded the company into the Newman's Own Foundation that same year, naming himself its sole member, the only person with legal authority over how the whole thing was run going forward. For years, the plan stayed consistent and specific. His daughters would rotate through seats on the foundation's board, one or two at a time. They'd have a real voice in where hundreds of millions of charitable dollars went every year, carrying his philanthropic instincts forward exactly the way he'd always said he wanted, and exactly the way he'd told them directly, more than once, that he intended. Then came 2008. Newman was diagnosed with lung cancer that same year, and medical records later showed he was also experiencing documented memory problems and disorientation in the months that followed, the kind of decline that makes legal capacity genuinely murky. 2 months before he died, he signed a document called a Consent of Soul Member, and with that single signature, he added 2 of his longtime advisors, Robert Forrester and Brian Murphy, as members of the foundation alongside him, permanently changing who actually controlled the organization. When Newman passed away in September of 2008, his daughters discovered that none of them, not one, held a seat on the board they had been told for years they would eventually run. The will itself only made things stranger. Awards and trophies went to the foundation. Joanne Woodward inherited personal property and art. A no-contest clause warned that anyone who challenged the will's terms would forfeit whatever they'd otherwise been entitled to receive. A clause specifically designed to discourage exactly the kind of legal fight that would eventually happen anyway. The whole structure had been amended 12 separate times over nearly 3 decades, with the final change coming just months before his death, leaving his family to sort out which version of his wishes was actually the real one. The fight nobody saw coming from a family known for staying quiet. For years, the Newman daughters mostly kept this private, the way the family had always handled difficult things. That changed in 2022, when 2 of Paul Newman's daughters, Nell and Susan, one from each of his marriages, filed a lawsuit against the very foundation their father had built, a legal step that broke decades of careful, image-conscious silence around the family's private business. Their claim was direct. They argued the reduction in what they and their sisters had been promised went directly against what their father had always told them he intended, that one of the foundation's directors had acted improperly, and that undue influence had been used on a vulnerable, dying man to get him to sign away commitments he'd made to his own children for years. It was a lawsuit accusing the people their father trusted most of taking advantage of him while he was sick and increasingly confused in his final, most vulnerable months alive, and it forced details about Newman's mental state in his last weeks into public court filings for the first time. Robert Forrester, the man who ended up running the foundation, pushed back firmly. He maintained that Newman had simply changed his mind on his own, that he'd never actually viewed Newman's own as a family business to begin with, and that Joanne Woodward had been fully aware of the changes as they happened. People close to the family disputed that last part specifically, saying Woodward's feelings about Forrester had actually become something close to an open sore within the family, something everyone around her understood without needing to ask. A tension that reportedly never really cooled even years afterward. The lawsuit dragged on, refiled in November of 2022 with an additional plaintiff, a business attorney the daughters had appointed as trustee to help protect their father's name and image rights going forward. Reporters who covered the case called it one of the most consequential donor intent disputes in modern philanthropy, a case study in what happens when a powerful man's stated wishes and his final paperwork stop matching each other, watched closely by estate lawyers and nonprofit boards far beyond the Newman family itself. In March of 2025, after years in court, both sides finally reached a settlement. The details were never made fully public. The foundation's longtime chief executive had already stepped down by the end of 2022 in the middle of the dispute, a departure that came without much public explanation either. Whatever the exact terms ended up being, the public fight itself had already done what tabloids and rumors never managed to do while Newman was alive. It forced a real conversation about whether the beloved, generous, golden couple image the world had constructed actually matched the choices the man made with the people who loved him most. What got left behind when the cameras finally stopped? While all of that played out in courtrooms, a quieter and far sadder story was unfolding inside the family, one that had nothing to do with money at all. In 2007, Just days before Paul Newman learned he had terminal cancer, Joanne Woodward was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The timing felt almost unbearably cruel. Two people who'd spent 50 years as each other's whole world, both losing pieces of themselves within days of each other, in the same year, inside the same house. Newman died the following year. Woodward kept living with the disease long afterward, retreating from public life, and eventually relocating for a period to be closer to her three daughters as her memory continued to fade. She made her final known public appearance in 2013. In the years since, by every account from people close to the family, the disease has progressed exactly the way these things tend to, taking dates, names, and eventually whole decades, piece by piece, the same 50-year marriage that once defined an entire era of American film slowly dissolving inside her own memory, even as she remains surrounded by daughters who never stopped showing up for her. There's something quietly devastating in that detail, sitting right alongside the inheritance fight. The man at the center of both stories spent his final years simultaneously losing his own clarity to illness and quietly rewriting the financial promises he'd made to his children, while the woman who'd shared his whole adult life was already starting to forget who he even was. Even their early love story carried more complication than people assume. Before Newman, Woodward had been linked publicly to the writer Gore Vidal, a connection she later explained wasn't romantic at all, but a cover she agreed to provide for a gay friend in a far less accepting era, and the two of them met Newman around the same time, while he was still married to Jackie Whitty. None of it was simple. None of it fit the picture audiences had spent decades happily believing in. Susan Newman, one of the two daughters who filed the original lawsuit, and one of the loudest voices pushing for accountability, passed away in August of 2025, remembered by her family for her sharp wit and her lifelong devotion to the causes her father had started. She didn't live to see whatever the settlement's quiet, undisclosed terms ultimately meant for the family going forward. But she did live long enough to see the fight itself become public, to see the version of her father that existed only on paper finally get measured against the version the world thought it knew. His daughters never tore down their father publicly, not really. They published his own doubts in his own words, in a memoir he himself once started and then tried to erase by burning the evidence. They fought for what they believed he'd actually promised them, in a courtroom rather than in front of cameras. And they kept showing up for their mother through an illness that's slowly taking away her ability to remember the very story everyone else still talks about. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a man spends a lifetime building a public image of generosity and devotion, does it matter more what he showed the world or what he actually left behind for the people who loved him? If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood tales, and hit the bell so you never miss a drop. Want more? Check out another one of our videos. Thanks for watching.